Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. It's great to have you here. Today, we've got something really exciting lined up, so make sure you stay tuned, hit that like button, and let's dive right in. The old Carter Mansion had stood at the edge of town for over a century, its crumbling facade and boarded-up windows a silent testament to its sinister history. Nestled deep within the woods, it was the kind of place that children dared each other to approach, but never quite managed to get closer than the rusted iron gate that surrounded it. Adults, too, whispered about the house, though always behind closed doors. Some said it was cursed, others that it was haunted by the spirits of the Carter family, who had all mysteriously perished one by one. For years, the house remained vacant, its secrets hidden behind walls that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. That is until the Johnson family moved in. Sarah and Tom Johnson were new to town, having moved from the city in search of a quieter, simpler life for themselves and their two children, Emily and Jack. The house had been on the market for years, its price dropping lower and lower until it was practically a steal. Despite its dilapidated state, the Johnsons were enchanted by its potential. Tom, a contractor by trade, saw it as the perfect fixer-upper, while Sarah, an artist, dreamed of transforming the mansion into a creative haven. The locals warned them, of course. They always did. But the Johnsons, practical and modern in their thinking, dismissed the stories as nothing more than superstitious nonsense. They moved in on a bright summer day, the sun shining down on the peeling paint and overgrown gardens as if to welcome them. The first few weeks were uneventful, with the family settling in and beginning the arduous process of renovating the old house. Tom spent his days tearing down rotted walls and replacing them with new ones, while Sarah focused on restoring the original woodwork and intricate stained glass windows. The children, delighted by the sheer size of the house, explored every nook and cranny, their laughter echoing through the empty halls. But as the days turned into weeks, a sense of unease began to settle over the family. It started with small things, the sound of footsteps in the hallway when no one was there, the feeling of being watched, the occasional flicker of the lights. Tom and Sarah brushed it off as the quirks of an old house, but the children were less easily convinced. "Mom, I heard someone whispering in my room last night," Emily said one morning over breakfast, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. Sarah smiled reassuringly, though she felt a chill run down her spine. "It was probably just the wind, sweetie. This house makes a lot of strange noises." But Emily was adamant. "It wasn't the wind. It was a voice. It said my name." Jack, who was only 7, chimed in. "I heard it too. And I saw a shadow in the corner of my room." Tom, who was more skeptical, ruffled his son's hair. "You kids have active imaginations. There's no such thing as ghosts." But the unease persisted. Emily continued to complain of hearing whispers at night, and Jack became increasingly withdrawn, refusing to sleep in his room. Sarah, too, began to notice strange occurrences, the feeling of a cold breath on her neck when she was alone, the sound of music playing softly in the distance, the unmistakable sensation of someone standing just behind her. The tension in the house grew, like a thick fog that seeped into every corner, making it hard to breathe. Sarah found herself becoming irritable and short-tempered, snapping at Tom and the kids over the smallest things. Tom, for his part, buried himself in his work, spending longer hours in the basement, which he was converting into a studio for Sarah. It was in the basement that things took a darker turn. Tom was working late one night, his hammer echoing off the walls, when he heard a low, guttural growl, like an animal's snarl, coming from the shadows. He froze, the hammer slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Heart pounding, Tom grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the dark corners of the basement, but there was nothing there. Just the unfinished walls and piles of lumber. Shaking his head, he told himself it was just his imagination, the result of too many late nights and too much stress. But as he turned to leave, he heard it again, this time closer, more menacing. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and he felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Something was down there with him. He could feel its presence, heavy and malevolent, watching him from the darkness. Tom fled the basement, his heart racing, and locked the door behind him. He didn't tell Sarah or the kids about what had happened, not wanting to scare them. But from that night on, he avoided the basement, only going down when absolutely necessary and never staying longer than he had to. Meanwhile, Sarah's unease grew. The whispers became more frequent, more insistent, and she began to have vivid nightmares, dreams of being trapped in the house, of walls closing in on her, of a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed, watching her as she slept. She woke up each morning drenched in sweat, her heart pounding, and with the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The final straw came one night when Sarah was alone in the house. Tom had taken the kids to visit his parents for the weekend, leaving Sarah to catch up on some work. It was late, and she was sitting in her studio, painting, when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of a piano playing. She froze, her brush hovering over the canvas. The sound was faint, almost ethereal, but there was no mistaking it. It was coming from somewhere in the house. Slowly, she got up and followed the sound, her heart thudding in her chest. The music led her to the living room, where the grand piano stood, untouched since they had moved in. The keys were moving on their own. Sarah stared in horror as the piano played a haunting melody, the notes echoing off the walls. She backed away, her breath coming in short gasps, but the music only grew louder, more insistent. It filled the room, drowning out all other sounds, until it was all she could hear, all she could think about. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stood there, trembling, her mind struggling to process what she had just witnessed. But before she could gather her thoughts, she heard it, a soft, whispering voice, coming from the shadows. Sarah. Her name, spoken in a voice that was not her own, echoed through the room. She turned, her eyes wide with terror, but there was no one there. Just the empty room and the dark, looming presence that seemed to fill it. Sarah. The voice was closer now, right behind her. She spun around, her heart in her throat, but still, there was nothing. And then she felt it, a cold, clammy hand on her shoulder, gripping her tightly. She screamed, the sound tearing from her throat, and bolted from the room. She ran up the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the empty house, and locked herself in the bedroom, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She sat on the bed, trembling, her mind racing with fear and confusion. But the worst was yet to come. As she sat there, trying to calm herself, she heard it, a slow, deliberate knock on the bedroom door. 3 knocks, spaced evenly apart. Her blood ran cold. She knew, instinctively, that whatever was on the other side of that door was not her husband, not her children, but something far more sinister. The knocking continued, each one louder than the last, until it was pounding on the door, shaking the walls. Sarah pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. It was inside her head, a relentless, pounding rhythm that matched the frantic beat of her heart. And then, with a final, thunderous crash, the door burst open. Sarah screamed as the door flew off its hinges and crashed to the floor. But there was nothing there, just the empty hallway, stretching out into the darkness. The pounding stopped, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Sarah was frozen in place, her mind a whirl of terror and disbelief. But then, she saw it. A figure, dark and indistinct, standing at the end of the hallway. It was tall, impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. Its form was shadowy, almost as if it was made of smoke, but its eyes were burning coals, red and searing, boring into her with an intensity that made her want to scream. It began to move toward her, its footsteps silent but deliberate, each step bringing it closer and closer. Sarah scrambled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but there was nowhere to go. The figure was almost upon her now, its eyes glowing brighter, its presence overwhelming. And then, just as it was about to reach her, it stopped. The figure seemed to waver, as if it was struggling to maintain its form. Its eyes dimmed, and for a moment, Sarah thought it might disappear. But then, with a sudden, terrifying clarity, she realized what it was doing. It was waiting. The realization hit her like a physical blow, and she stumbled back, her heart racing. The figure remained where it was, its eyes fixed on her, its presence pressing down on her like a weight. It was as if it was daring her to move, daring her to try and escape. But Sarah couldn't move. She was paralyzed by fear, her mind a whirl of terror and confusion. The figure remained still, its eyes boring into her, and she felt a cold dread settle over her. And then, slowly, it began to speak. The voice was low, guttural, and filled with malice. It was a voice that seemed to come from the depths of the earth, a voice that carried with it the weight of centuries of suffering and pain. "You cannot escape," it said, its words echoing in the empty hallway. "You are mine now." Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and she felt a wave of terror wash over her. She tried to scream, but the sound caught in her throat, strangled by the fear that gripped her. The figure began to move toward her again, its steps slow and deliberate, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "You belong to me," it said, its voice sending chills down her spine. "This house is mine. And now, so are you." Sarah stumbled back, her heart racing, but there was nowhere to go. The figure was almost upon her now, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. She felt its breath on her neck, cold and fetid, and she knew that she was trapped. In that moment, something inside her snapped. A primal instinct took over, and she lashed out, her hand striking the figure with all the strength she could muster. Her hand passed through it as if it was made of smoke, and for a moment, she thought she was doomed. But then, the figure recoiled, its form flickering and wavering. It let out a low, guttural growl, and for a moment, its eyes dimmed. Sarah seized the moment and bolted from the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She raced down the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the empty house, and ran out the front door, not stopping until she was well away from the mansion. She didn't look back, didn't dare to, until she was standing at the edge of the woods, panting and trembling. When she finally turned around, the house was dark and silent, its windows like empty eyes staring back at her. But she could feel it, the malevolent presence that still lingered within, watching her, waiting for her to return. She didn't. The next morning, when Tom returned with the kids, he found the house empty. Sarah was gone, and the front door was wide open, as if she had fled in a panic. He searched the house, calling her name, but there was no sign of her. It was Emily who found the note, scrawled in Sarah's handwriting, lying on the kitchen table. It was short, just a few words, but it sent chills down Tom's spine. "I'm sorry. I can't stay. The house, it wants me." Tom didn't believe in ghosts, but as he read the note, he couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened to his wife. He searched the woods, called the police, but no one ever found any trace of Sarah. The house remained empty after that, its windows boarded up once more, its secrets buried deep within its walls. The Johnsons moved away, leaving the town and its whispers behind. But the house remained. And every now and then, on a quiet night, the townspeople swear they can hear the sound of a piano playing, a soft, haunting melody that drifts through the woods, carried on the wind. And if you listen closely, you might hear it too, the whispering voice calling your name, beckoning you to come closer, to step inside, to join the others who have vanished within its walls. For the house is always hungry, always waiting. And once you enter, it will never let you go.